What if the bravest thing you could do right now is not another explanation, not another late night paragraph, not another attempt to be understood by someone committed to misunderstanding you? What if the most powerful thing you could do is nothing at all? No reaching, no proving, no over-explaining, no trying to make your pain digestible enough for someone else to finally call it valid. Just one quiet decision, a decision to stop abandoning yourself in order to keep someone else comfortable. And I know at first that kind of silence can feel terrifying, because when you've been the one carrying the emotional weight, the fixer, the initiator, the one who keeps the thread from breaking, silence doesn't feel powerful in the beginning. It feels like withdrawal. It feels like grief. It feels like standing in the middle of an empty room with your hands open, realizing how often you've confused effort with love. But there is a holy kind of silence, a healing kind of silence, a silence that is not punishment, a silence that is not manipulation, a silence that says, I have finally decided that my peace is too expensive to keep paying for with my self-respect. And that changes everything. Because the truth is, it's never just the silence that shakes someone. It's what happens inside that silence. It's what happens when they expect you to remain available, and instead you become unavailable in the most grounded, most whole, most self-honoring way possible. It's what happens when they expect your attention and are met with your absence, when they expect your emotional labor and are met with your boundaries, when they expect your longing and are met with your peace. That is what unsettles them. Not because you became cruel, not because you became cold, but because you became clear. And clarity is disruptive to people who benefited from your confusion. Let's tell the truth here. A lot of us were never really waiting on clarity from them. We were waiting for permission to choose ourselves. We were waiting for one more sign, one more text, one more conversation, one more chance to believe that if we just loved harder, gave more, softened again, bent one more time, then maybe this would finally become mutual. But love that requires your self-abandonment is not love. Connection that depends on your confusion is not connection. And attention that only appears when you start to pull away was never the kind of devotion your heart was built for. There comes a moment, and maybe you're in it now, when you realize you are exhausted not because you loved too much, but because you loved in places where you were asked to do all the carrying. You carried the hope. You carried the conversations. You carried the emotional temperature of the relationship. You carried the excuses. You carried the benefit of the doubt. You carried the story of who they could be while ignoring the evidence of who they were actually choosing to be. And somewhere in all of that carrying, you got tired. Not dramatic tired. Not attention-seeking tired. Soul tired. The kind of tired that doesn't want another fight. Doesn't want another circular conversation. Doesn't want another almost. Doesn't want another, I'm just confused. I've got a lot going on. I'm not ready, while still expecting full access to your heart. And that kind of tired can become sacred if you let it. Because sometimes exhaustion is not weakness. Sometimes exhaustion is your spirit telling the truth before your mind is ready to hear it. It is saying, this is costing too much. And the moment you listen to that truth, something begins to shift. You stop thinking your power lives in convincing someone to choose you. You stop believing your worth increases the longer you endure inconsistency. You stop treating your tenderness like a coupon people can redeem whenever it's convenient for them. And instead, you begin the slow, brave work of coming home to yourself. That's what makes the silence powerful. Not the absence of sound, the presence of self. It is one thing to stop texting. It is another thing entirely to stop negotiating against your own needs. It is one thing to go quiet for a few days while secretly hoping they panic. It is another thing to go quiet because you have finally understood that your healing can no longer be built around someone else's potential. That is the turning point. Because when your silence is rooted in strategy, you're still orbiting them. But when your silence is rooted in self-respect, you have begun orbiting your own truth. And people feel that. They may not have language for it. They may not be emotionally mature enough to name it. But they feel the difference between she's trying to get a reaction and she is genuinely no longer available for what once passed as enough. That difference is seismic. See, when someone has grown accustomed to your availability, your softness, your willingness to repair what you didn't break, they begin to mistake your presence for permanence. They start to believe you'll always be there, always understand, always forgive, always circle back, always leave the door cracked. And maybe you did. Maybe because you loved them. Maybe because you saw the good in them. Maybe because the version of you that hoped was stronger than the version of you that knew. But when that changes, when the woman who always reached out suddenly begins to rest, when the woman who always explained suddenly chooses privacy, when the woman who always made room suddenly closes the door and lights a candle in her own house instead, the whole dynamic shifts. Because now they are not experiencing your anger. They are experiencing your absence. And absence has a way of revealing value that presence once made easy to overlook. That's the hard truth about human nature. People rarely understand the shape of what held them until it is no longer there. The good morning texts they didn't fully appreciate. The check-ins. The emotional steadiness. The warmth. The generosity. The way you made room for their inconsistencies while still offering care. The way your love created a sense of home they thought they could revisit whenever they felt lonely. When that disappears, not with chaos, but with dignity, not with theatrics, but with truth, it creates a kind of reckoning. And let me be clear, this is not about making someone suffer. This is about no longer volunteering to suffer in order to stay connected. There is a difference, a big one. One comes from revenge. The other comes from reverence. Reverence for your own life, for your nervous system, for your mornings, for your joy. For the future self, who deserves a version of you that is not constantly depleted from trying to be enough for someone who keeps meeting you with half-heartedness. And yes, when you begin to live from that place, they notice. They notice because the pattern breaks. You were the one who checked in. Now you don't. You were the one who kept the bridge from collapsing. Now your hands are off the rope. You were the one who made it easy for them to remain emotionally underdeveloped while still receiving the benefits of your love. Now the supply is gone, and suddenly they are left alone with the very thing your overfunctioning once protected them from. Consequences. That's often what people call he starts losing his mind. But let's name it more honestly. What he starts losing is comfort, certainty, access. The illusion that your love would remain available no matter how little he reciprocated. And when access is removed, reality gets louder. He may start replaying conversations. He may revisit moments he once brushed past. He may wonder why your energy feels different. He may check your social media more often than he'd admit. He may become preoccupied not because you made a scene, but because you didn't. Because when people expect noise and receive peace, they don't know what to do with it. Peace is unnerving to people who counted on your emotional reactivity. And here is where your work really begins. Not in getting them to notice, but in refusing to make their noticing the goal. That's the trap. Because if you go silent but spend every day checking whether it's working, you are still waiting. If you withdraw outwardly but remain inwardly consumed, you are still tethered. If your healing is still secretly a performance for someone else's recognition, then your life is still sitting in their hands. And your life is too sacred for that. So the invitation is deeper than silence. The invitation is release. Release the need to be understood by someone who only values the parts of your truth that require nothing of them. Release the fantasy that one perfect explanation will awaken the effort they have not yet chosen. Release the need to manage their perception of you. Release the compulsion to prove that your hurt is justified. Release the habit of monitoring whether your absence is finally making you important. You were important before they noticed. You were worthy before they were ready. You were enough before this story began. And one of the most transformative moments in a woman's life is when she stops asking, how do I make him understand what he lost? And starts asking, why have I been fighting so hard to remain available in a place that keeps asking me to betray myself? That question changes everything. Because now the focus comes back to the only life you can actually save, your own. You begin to notice how much energy has been trapped in analysis, in checking, in rehearsing conversations that will never happen, in imagining what you would say if he came back, in wondering whether he misses you, in scanning for signs, in trying to decode someone who has had every opportunity to be clear. And then maybe slowly, maybe all at once, you decide to reclaim that energy. You will pour it into your body, into rest, into your work, into your friends, into long walks without your phone in your hand, into meals you actually taste, into laughter that is not interrupted by wondering whether he texted back, into mornings that begin with your own breath instead of your own anxiety. This is the part nobody talks about enough. Healing is not always dramatic. Sometimes healing is profoundly ordinary. It is making your coffee and realizing you haven't checked his page in 3 days. It is going to dinner and laughing from your belly again. It is listening to music without assigning every lyric to your heartbreak. It is buying flowers for your own table. It is sleeping through the night. It is no longer building your emotional weather report around someone else's inconsistency. That is power. And that power is magnetic because it is real, not curated, not performative. Not look how unbothered I am. Just rooted. You are rooted in your own life again. And when that happens, yes, people who took your presence lightly often begin to feel the loss more acutely. Because now it is not just that you are gone. It is that you are gone and well. Gone and growing, gone and grounded, gone and no longer available for crumbs disguised as connection. That is what creates the ache, not your silence by itself, but your refusal to shrink in the silence. And maybe the deepest truth in all of this is that your silence does not just change how they experience you. It changes how you experience yourself. You begin to trust yourself. Trust that you can feel grief without running back. Trust that you can miss someone and still not choose them. Trust that love does not obligate access. Trust that boundaries are not punishments. Trust that peace is not something you earn by being endlessly understanding. Trust that your heart can survive disappointment without bargaining for less than it deserves. That kind of self-trust is life-changing. Because once you know you can hold yourself, you stop accepting people who only know how to drop you. And that is when standards stop being something you say and become something you live. You stop announcing your worth and start organizing your life around it. You stop threatening to leave and start leaving what dishonors you. You stop hoping someone will become emotionally fluent enough to meet you. And you begin choosing environments where reciprocity does not have to be begged for. That shift is quiet. But it is revolutionary. And if he notices, he notices. If he regrets it, he regrets it. If your absence begins to echo in his mind, that is his work to face. But your freedom cannot be contingent on his realization. That is the real maturity. That is the real healing. That is the real glow. Not, I hope he sees what he lost. But I finally see what I lose every time I keep choosing someone who cannot hold what I offer. That awareness changes the entire story. Now, if he comes back, it lands differently because you are no longer starving for clarity. You are listening for consistency. You are listening for accountability. You are listening for whether his actions carry the weight your heart requires. And if they do not, you are no longer tempted to translate disappointment into possibility. That is growth. Growth is not becoming hard. It is becoming honest. Honest about what drains you. Honest about what keeps you stuck. Honest about where hope has become self-harm. Honest about how often you called it love when it was actually longing or potential or chemistry or your deep desire to be chosen. There is no shame in that. We have all confused longing for love at some point. We have all mistaken emotional intensity for emotional safety. We have all tried to earn what should have been freely given. But there is also freedom in telling the truth. The truth that you do not need to convince the right person to care. The truth that your tenderness is not a resource for emotionally unavailable people to consume. The truth that being deeply loving should never require becoming deeply depleted. The truth that some doors only look painful to close because they have kept you living in false hope. And false hope is exhausting. It makes you postpone your life. It makes you romanticize inconsistency. It makes you keep your heart on hold while your spirit quietly withers. So yes, sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is close the door without slamming it. Walk away without performing it. Choose yourself without announcing it. That is not weakness. That is wisdom. It is the kind of wisdom that says, I do not need one more conversation to validate what my body has already understood. I do not need to become louder in order to be worthy of being heard. I do not need to chase mutuality. I do not need to beg for what should be given with joy. And maybe, just maybe, this is not the chapter where he finally understands you. Maybe this is the chapter where you finally understand you. Maybe this is the chapter where you stop confusing devotion with endurance, where you stop measuring love by how much pain you can survive, where you stop handing your precious, brilliant, tender self to people who like access more than they value intimacy. Maybe this is the chapter where you become unavailable, not because you are bitter, but because you are finally becoming available to your own life, available to joy, available to rest, available to honesty, available to the kind of love that does not make you audition for your own belonging. And I know that may not sound as dramatic as make him lose his mind. But here's what I want to tell you. The greatest victory was never supposed to be his obsession. It was always supposed to be your freedom. Freedom from the waiting. Freedom from the analyzing. Freedom from the cycle of hoping that this time your pain will teach someone how to love you properly. Freedom from believing that your worth rises and falls on the timing of someone else's attention. Because when you stop waiting, really stop, not just externally but deep in your bones, you become impossible to manipulate with inconsistency. And that is unforgettable. A woman who knows she can miss you and still not return to what broke her? Unforgettable. A woman who can love deeply without abandoning herself? Unforgettable. A woman who walks away with grief in her chest and dignity in her spine? Unforgettable. A woman who does not need the last word because she has chosen the last boundary? Unforgettable. That woman is not cold. She is clear. She is not punishing. She is protecting. She is not playing hard to get. She has simply become hard to misuse. And yes, that kind of clarity may rattle the people who benefited from the older version of you, the version who over-explained, who gave one more chance, who answered the late-night text, who accepted the almost, who called scraps a meal because she was starving for sincerity. But that version of you is allowed to evolve. In fact, she must, because your life is waiting. Your peace is waiting. Your joy is waiting. The truest, deepest, most rooted version of you is waiting. Not for him, for you. So if you are standing in that tender place right now, holding your phone, holding your grief, holding the urge to reach out one more time, let me say this as clearly as I can. Take your hands off what keeps breaking your heart. Breathe. Let this silence be a sanctuary, not a weapon. Let the distance become discernment. Let the ache become information. Let the ending become an invitation back to yourself. You do not need to perform your pain. You do not need to explain your worth. You do not need to keep proving that your love is real by how much you are willing to tolerate. You are allowed to be done, allowed to be tender and done. Allowed to be loving and done, allowed to miss him and still be done, allowed to grieve and still move, allowed to walk away without hatred, allowed to choose peace without permission. And if one day it finally hits him, if he wakes up to the emptiness where your warmth used to be, if he replays the way you loved him and realizes too late that it was rare, that will be part of his story. But this right here, this is yours. The story of a woman who stopped shrinking, stopped circling, stopped waiting in the wings of someone else's uncertainty, stopped confusing being chosen with being worthy, and began, maybe for the first time in a long time, to choose herself with the kind of fierce tenderness that changes a life. That is the real power of silence. Not that it makes him wonder, but that it teaches you that you were never lost, only waiting to return to yourself. And once you do that, once you return to yourself fully, honestly, courageously, There is no going back to begging for what your soul already knows it deserves. So let the silence speak. Let it clear the noise. Let it break the pattern. Let it reveal who they are. Let it remind you who you are. And then keep going. Not toward revenge. Not toward validation. Not toward the fantasy of being finally understood by someone who could not meet you where you stood. Go toward your life. Go toward the version of you who sleeps well, who laughs freely, who no longer checks her worth in someone else's eyes, who understands that love without reciprocity is grief in disguise, who knows that self-respect is not loud, but it is unshakable. Go toward the version of you who has stopped waiting, because the moment you stop waiting for him to become ready is the moment you become free. And freedom, real freedom, is louder than any text you could send.